when the Amistad Research Center asked me to host an event in New York, I immediately thought about their archives and the importance of talking to New Yorkers who are making a big difference in New York City. And Phil, as you explained, not just in New York City, but around the world. Um, Phil Isom is a partner at Wilkie Farr and Gallagher, and someone who I've worked with on private equity transactions where I was working as the investment banker and Phil was working as the lawyer. Um, but there's much more that comes before that for someone like Phil who grew up in New York, um, uh, grew up in Harlem,
Yep,
still lives there, yeah,
that's right.
and and was the second partner to join the private equity practice at Wilkie Farr
In 2011, but private equity more refined than just private equity generally, but private equity fund formation.
okay,
Yeah, so we'll get into that.
right, right. And now, having been there for 8 years, the practice has grown to 50 lawyers. And it was a domestic practice that now is an international practice. As this is an archive interview, it kind of makes sense to start back at the beginning, if not even before your beginning. I mentioned to you when we talked earlier that an interesting aphorism has been coined by a Harvard admissions officer who says that if you define African American as having 4 black grandparents born in the United States, only about 30% of the black students admitted to Harvard these days are African American, and so that leads to a question about your past. Sure. Do you have 4 black grandparents born in the United States?
Yeah, I do actually.
And where were they born?
So my dad is from a small town in Alabama. There are 2 towns kind of next to each other, Valley and Lynette, Alabama. Yeah, exactly. You and the 2 other people. And so that's where he's from. And my mom is from a small town in South Carolina called Hemingway, South Carolina.
Wow.
And when I used to go visit them both.
Your grandparents?
Yeah, well, yeah. And so on my mom's side, in Hemingway, I think they got a street light probably 20 years ago.
Really?
Wow. And up until that point, a lot of the roads were dirt roads. And
Incredible.
so when I used to go down there, it was, barefoot running around.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. And what did your grandparents do in Alabama and in South Carolina?
Yeah, so I didn't know my maternal grandfather. I never met him.
Yeah.
But so my maternal grandmother, she, I guess you could say a farmer, picked tobacco down in a small town down there. And then my paternal grandparents, they were considered educated because they both graduated from high school.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And so at some points they taught in the school, but my dad ended up, my grandfather on my dad's side ended up working in a factory for many years and down there. And my dad talks about, talks all the time about how my grandfather was was also very intelligent, but in the factory that they worked in, most of the white people in that town were not. And so there were people that were his supervisor who couldn't really read.
Yeah.
And they would get him to do all of the
To read.
to read for them and to do the work for him. And my grandmother, she taught mostly in the school.
Oh,
down
really?
there. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Interesting. So what do you think what do you think contributes to this this aphorism that the Harvard admissions officer has kind of, mined out of looking at application after application and background after background, and concluding that having an immigrant grandparent or being of mixed race elevates in a comparative sense the success that students have in the admissions process at elite colleges.
Yeah. It's interesting because you mentioned that statistic, and I was starting to reflect on that. I mean, I guess the first question is the conclusion based on the demographics that one group is doing better, or is it just that the field or the amount of people who have the opportunity is widened, and so therefore there is a different mixture of people? I mean, because what the question I have is, there's another question in there, but the first question I have when I think about that statistic is to what extent does the global opportunity associated with going to elite schools like Harvard,
Right.
How does that impact that? And then secondly, how does the impact of interracial relationships, how is that just to impact that, which is a natural progression of the change in the times?
Yeah, yeah.
So thinking about the statistics, I think you have to
Yeah.
think about that.
Yeah.
But there's another question in there, Keith, that I haven't thought about much more than just based on what this is, which is the experience of, let's say, African Americans or blacks, in this country, this American experience. That's an experience that comes out of slavery, right? And what are the implications of that, and how you deal with that,
Exactly.
and how does that manifest itself in this community?
Exactly.
But then when you think about blacks from the continent, their experience is out of overcoming colonialization,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So what is the impact of growing up in a culture, one which is eradicating slavery and Jim Crow, and the other one is dealing with overturning the colonializers? How does that have an impact on how people view themselves or view their struggle, and how does that manifest itself? I mean, it's just something I thought about
Yeah.
today,
Absolutely.
which is
That's what
like,
we're talking about.
yeah, how do you, what's in there?
Well, it could be a sense of optimism. Someone comes here from another country, and by definition, they see this as the land of opportunity. If you grew up here, if you have 4 black grandparents born here, and 8 black grandparents born here, and 16 great grandparents, so you then have a lot of sources of cynicism that are kind of giving you advice over the generations, and maybe it has something to do with optimism versus cynicism that inhibits African Americans who have 4 black grandparents born here. You know, that it takes some close familial interaction with an optimist to sort of make the investment as a kid, to succeed in getting into Harvard or University of Pennsylvania, where you went to college. So the other, there's another sort of kind of optimism that comes from migrating from Alabama or South Carolina to New York City. And there may be an analogy there with your parents who came from the South to the North. And there is a sense, I mean, having grown up in the South, there's a sense that when you leave the South and go north, that you are an immigrant of a sort. Did you have a sense for that? I mean, was that a kind of part of was there a certain optimism in your household that?
It's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking about the impact of, particularly my mom and both my mom and dad's experiences as kids growing up in the segregated South, and some of the things that they experienced as kids growing up there, even into their adult life, which, for example, my dad, when you would talk to him about going back to Alabama, he really had a hard time doing that, and spending time there because he has so many deep emotional scars from his interactions with white people during that time.
What year was he born?
41, I think. If I think about it, he's going to be 80 this year, next year. So next year. So that's 1940. So he has a lot of deep feelings. And his are manifested in a kind of a macho way towards people who are not black. And then my mom having a similar experience, a lot of similar experiences growing up in the South and working in the fields and picking tobacco in the town that they were from. And she had also similar kind of deep feelings that would manifest themselves, but they would manifest themselves not as an aggressive or an angry perspective, but more of a defeated perspective sometimes. Not to say defeated in a sense that you can't achieve, because that was never a perspective in my house. My house was always that you can do whatever you want, and you can achieve what you want. But the possibilities or the limits of that, they didn't really have a perspective, and because they didn't come from that, so they didn't see that. But thinking about some of the conversations that we had as a kid growing up, and even my kids, which have a totally different experience, and they sit, and my mom passed away 2 years ago, but even when they talk to my father, they take in or hear some of his still emotional scars when he talked about people, and so it has an impact. And so that's in the whole system of what I grew up with, didn't know any different. And just, like you hear people nowadays talk about the talk, about how you conduct yourself when you stop by police. And so when I was growing up, I mean, I grew up in East Harlem in the projects, and so you really shouldn't be cut off your block, and you can't go too far. And one of the things was never go downtown.
Oh, really?
Just don't go downtown, because if you go downtown, they're going to pick you up, and they're going to, so if you go downtown, you need to talk to me before you do that.
Really?
Now I went to school downtown, but it's like you go to school, you come home, don't
linger.
don't linger, and so a lot of that was just part of what's in the water.
That's incredible.
And so, so like one of the big things for me, and as it translates into professional life and growing up, is I really kind of lived and grew up in a situation where I was in two different worlds, right? I went to the neighborhood public school, really like 2 blocks from where I grew up, our project.
Yeah. Which school was that?
It's PS 83.
Okay.
So I went there, and like I said, my father, I grew up in a household where education was very important. So, from the day I was born, not the day I was born, but early, he was, we got to learn how to read, we got to do this, we got to learn, I knew my multiplication tables in like second grade. It was like, that's what was.
Right.
And but being in that school, they identified me as someone who they thought was intellectually gifted. And so I ended up going to a school that was downtown.
Now this is, so do you remember that time?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So this is, 64, 70, 72, 73. So I'm like
You're
third or fourth grade, 8 years old. So I go to, I'm just the kid.
Does someone come to your parents, or what
Yeah,
is that?
yeah. No, that's what they, so in the school, and someone came to them and said, we think that there's a school that he might, really be able to excel in. Because it's a funny story. So like my dad, he didn't trust anyone. So in the second grade, we talk about it. My mom used to talk about it. So in the second grade, my dad was convinced that the teacher wasn't teaching me anything. And I only learned when he was teaching me at home, right? Because there was nothing going on in school. And so he snuck into the school and was peering in the window into the classroom because he wanted to prove that I wasn't being taught anything.
Yeah.
It happened to be a time when the teacher had somehow had convinced me that I should read to the class and teach the class some book. And so he saw that and said, I knew it, and I want you out of here, and he put him in a different class, and so that was also around the time when they said, well, okay, maybe this other school might be interesting.
Interesting.
So you take a test, and I remember taking a test. I didn't really know what I was doing, and so then I ended up transferring to a school now in New York that a lot of kids go to, but it's Hunter Elementary School, and it was a school for quote unquote intellectually gifted kids.
So it's a magnet.
Yeah,
school?
so it's I guess what you would call it now is a magnet school.
Magnet school.
And it's still it's very challenging to get into and stuff like that. But it was not as known at that time. Now it's a big deal.
It's kind of the Stuyvesant of grammar schools, or
grammar school, and then go up to high school.
It goes all the way up to high school.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I thought you'd gotten a basketball scholarship at third grade,
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But that's pretty incredible. So when you went there, you mentioned this sense of being bicultural in some sense. Did you have, is that when you sort of noticed this biculturalism, or did you have a sense of being bicultural even before that as a?
No, yeah, I think it probably started then, because I really didn't have any interaction with people other than the Black people and the Latino people who were in my neighborhood before then.
Right.
And so going there, started to have interactions with people from different cultures and different ethnicities. And during that time, as you start to see the differences and what it's like, I mean, I remember probably in the 5th grade, I went to a birthday party at one of my classmates' house. And as soon as I got home, my parents, they just interrogated me about, well, what was their house like? What did they do? What did you eat? You know, it was a very kind of inquisitive, but also fearful, and wondering what that was like.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think at the same time, while I was there, there were, you know, it was part of a strategy I think that the school had to try to attract kids who were from, you know, from Harlem specifically, in East Harlem, and so there were other kids that were there, and we kind of spent a lot of our time together. But one of the things that was unique about Hunter is that it wasn't, because it was not a private school,
Yeah.
the socioeconomic disparities and differences that you will see in the private school situation today, we didn't see that. It was a lot of, saw some of it, but it wasn't as pronounced. In terms of the uber wealthy.
Right.
But it was different because I was a poor kid. I mean, I was, you know.
So did you notice did it live up to its reputation as academically challenging and
there was a lot of
surprisingly demanding
there was demanding, I mean, but I could keep up, but what was really shocking, and I learned it in elementary school and then in high school, as to how smart the people there were. And, you know, and not realizing kind of the difference of being in that environment to when you take the kids out, when you took all of us who were there out of that environment and sprinkled them around, how, I mean, there was just some people who were just really at a far end of the spectrum in terms of intellect.
Right.
And in some respects, by being in that environment, you never thought that you were smart because there was always
someone who was in another zip code.
Yeah. So, but the cultural part of it was always interesting, and you know, so I mean, it wasn't like I was a kid who grew up in East Harlem and didn't have friends in my. I mean, my parents were very much a part of the community. You know, in all of the housing projects, people who are familiar with it, and you have, you know, the people in the building who want to protect the building. So you have a tenant patrol and all these types of things. And my dad, not so much because of just how he is, but my mom was very active in all of that. And so, and then, you know, having close friends that you grow up with. But so in that is where you start to see, you know, there's just two different worlds.
I remember when my daughter was interviewing at various schools in New York. One of them said, I asked, well, if there's anything that concerns you about your school, what is it? And the answer was, something that's concerning is that young black men who are our students at 12, 13, 14 years old seem to pull away from the school's culture because they're trying to relate to the kids in the community. And many of them have a challenge with that and have trouble, you know, sort of reconciling these two cultures that you were talking about at that age. Did you feel that in any way?
I didn't have trouble trying to reconcile it as much as just exist, right? Because I really wasn't trying to reconcile it, right? I wasn't trying to fit in. You know,
Fit into the neighborhood.
well, I fit in the neighborhood. That's where I felt comfortable.
Okay.
But I didn't try to fit in at school.
Ah, I see. Okay.
And so it wasn't, so I didn't have that challenge reconciling from that perspective. As a personal thing. Now, it was in retrospect, it was a challenge because I probably should have tried to fit in more. I should have tried to, when I say fit in, to make stronger connections with people.
Right.
And I didn't.
Yeah.
And I was pretty intentional about not. I mean, I have kids that I went to high school with who I was close friends with during that time, but it was mostly around sports.
Right.
It was people that were on my team.
Right.
And that was the connection. But outside of that, there wasn't like a real concerted effort to make friends.
Right.
Not to say that I was standoffish, it was just it wasn't, I gravitated towards the people who I felt more comfortable with, which were people also from Harlem or from the Bronx who were going to Hunter, and people I played sports with. That was my, that's how you could define all of my friends from high school. They were in one of those two categories.
Right. Interesting. Well, I mean, in some ways, it may have been easier to fit in where you were from, as opposed to trying to fit in with your schoolmates who were different, even though it would have been idyllic maybe if it could have gone the other way. But my sense is that where more problematic is the opposite. Where kids once did fit in, and then found themselves trying to relate later in their teenage years, and kind of overcompensating, to fit in.
It's interesting. What it reminds me of when you're talking about that, Keith, is thinking about my kids' experience, how very different it is than my experience. And because they are, I guess, now kids of means, of wealth, although I still live in Harlem,
Right.
Their friends are not, their friends are the kids they go to school with.
Yeah.
And the kids that they've gone to school with
Right.
have been predominantly white or, predominantly, but more Upper West, quote unquote, Upper West Side kids. And so they have had a different, trying to figure out how they fit in. And there's been, I think they've always tried to navigate the issue that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I don't, for example, my oldest daughter, who's now a third year at Harvard in the law school, I think it wasn't until she got to law school where she was actually most comfortable being involved in kind of the African American student organizations, right?
Right.
So like when she went to Penn, being involved in the Black student organizations or things like that at Penn, or or my son when he was at Penn, joining a Black fraternity, that was not what he was interested in.
Right.
He became a member of a white fraternity.
Huh.
And oddly enough, his roommate, who was also Black, they both became the two Black members of a white fraternity at Penn.
Right.
And that's where they felt most comfortable.
Right.
Both of them. And so it was,
Even though they grew up in Harlem.
even though they grew up in Harlem.
Yeah.
Now, and so that experience of which is similar to what you're describing with your daughter's experience, and she went to Brearley, right? Which is where my oldest daughter went to school.
Right. Yeah.
I could see that being, that question being on the table for them, in the way you're describing it.
So you graduate from Hunter after being there for 9 years or 10 years.
Yeah, from fourth grade all the way
Oh,
up.
fourth grade.
Yeah,
Okay.
all the way through,
And you go to University of Pennsylvania. Was college in some sense easier than high school?
It was actually.
Yeah.
And I was at Wharton.
Uh-huh.
It's I was able to kind of just skate through college in some respects. I remember my freshman year at Penn, every class that I took, I had taken already.
Wow.
Now that doesn't mean I got all A's,
Right.
but
Right.
I didn't see anything that I hadn't seen before. But the biggest thing for me that the transition from high school to college was, I think that college was the first time where my closest friends to this day are my friends from college. And then there's a couple of friends who I grew up with who are now within my same college circle friends. It's kind of like I brought them into that same circle, and we're all, those are my closest set of friends. And what's interesting is I think about the dynamic that I had in high school and what I was looking for in college. I remember there was two things. One, having a conversation with my college advisor about wanting to go to Morehouse. And
This is after you were at Penn.
no, this is
before. Your college advisor
yeah, but college advisor at high
Hunter.
school,
Yeah.
and helping me to sort through,
Yeah.
the process
Yeah.
and colleges
Yeah.
and things. Because my dad went to Tuskegee.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And but so I said to my college advisor, she's like, so what do you have interest? What are you thinking about? And I said, well, there's a black college in Atlanta, and a lot of prominent black men have gone to, and this college, Morehouse. And she looked at me cross-eyed and said, well, why would you want to go to a college like that? And I felt totally embarrassed, actually. And kind of said, oh, okay, well, I thought it might be nice. And like, yeah, you don't need to, you're going to have great options. You don't have to go to a school like that. And I didn't apply to Morehouse. Oddly enough, my brother was 4 years behind me, actually did go to Morehouse.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
And graduated from there. But going through the college process, so I applied to 4 schools, wasn't really a lot of science put into it. I applied to Columbia and NYU because they were good schools in New York.
Yeah.
I applied to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh because I thought maybe engineering was something I might be interested in. I applied to Penn.
Huh.
And I applied to Penn because one, it was an Ivy League school with a business school. So it had undergraduate, and so I had Wharton. And then one of my close friends from growing up, still one of my closest friends, and actually went to Harvard Business School as well. He went to Penn for a weekend and said, you need to go to this place, check this place out, because he went to Penn during Penn relays.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And said how much fun he had, and
Yeah.
talked about the fraternities and the
Yeah.
sororities
Yeah.
and the black people,
Yeah.
and so that's how Penn ended up on the list, and I ended up going there. And it's funny, like I'm going through the college process now, and this goes back to your point about the difference between me growing up and my kids. I applied to Columbia and Penn. I mean, Columbia and NYU, I kind of knew they were in the city. I didn't go visit. Carnegie Mellon, I never went to visit. And Penn, I didn't go visit either. I just applied, got in, and then it was like, okay, I'm going. This is where I'm going to school. And then it was probably like maybe a couple of months before I was supposed to go.
Uh,
And my dad said, you know what, we probably should go look at this place to see where you're going to. So we got in the car and we drove and walked into Philly and just walked around campus, and that was the first time I saw it.
wow.
And I was going to be there, and now contrast that to.
Did your dad think it was all right?
Yeah, he said, okay, this looks like an interesting place to go to college.
Yeah.
Then contrast that to my kids, and particularly my youngest. I think, she's going to apply early decision to Penn, but at this point we've visited probably about 12 or 13 colleges.
Wow.
As part of her process. And it was more of a process to see all the different schools to make sure that Penn is the right choice.
Now she'll be your third kid to go to third kid to go to Penn.
Yeah.
She probably doesn't have to apply at this point.
I wish that was the case.
You're an Isom, come on. So then you graduate from Penn, and did you go to Penn Law School as well?
No, I went to Columbia Law.
To Columbia Law School.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I graduated from Penn. I majored in finance, and so at that time, and this is '86, right? So in '86, the credit training programs at all of the banks, that was the big thing. So I did credit training at a bank that most people don't know it existed, Manufacturers Hanover, Manny Hanny.
Yeah.
So I did credit training there and was in banking, did the commercial banking for 2 years, and the question, law school, business school, and then I decided to go to law school. I didn't think that I would ever practice law though.
Really?
No, I thought I would go to law school and then come back to some career in finance or
But you didn't think that as a law student or
No, even
or
as
applying to law school?
Even when I applied to law school, I wasn't sure that I would ever practice law.
Okay.
I thought of it as an opportunity to diversify my experience and background. But this is, there's a bunch of these little things in my life that are, kind of God looking down on me and taking care of me. I only applied to one law school. I only applied to Columbia.
Is that right?
And my thought was, if I don't get into Columbia, then I'll just go to business school. Because I had in my mind convinced myself that I got a 3-year window here, and I can go to law school. And if I don't go, then
business school's only 2 years.
2 years, and I'll still be in the same place.
Right. Wow. And so you got into Columbia, and did you enjoy law school?
Yeah, law school was good. I wasn't prepared for it. It was another one of these situations where I just didn't know what I was getting myself into. So I wasn't prepared for it. I had in college, as I sort of alluded to, I didn't work too hard.
Right.
And so when you get to law school, there's no way you got to do the work.
Right.
And you got to put the time in, and you got to do all the readings, and there was a discipline that I didn't have around academic environment in that situation. I had that discipline at work.
Right.
Because work was always easier to me than academics.
Right.
And it still is, but so I didn't have that discipline going into it. So my first year of law school was challenging. But I guess the highlight of first year law school is I met my wife.
Oh, right.
She was a law student as well.
Oh, was she?
Yeah, and so we were together.
Was she in your same class?
So we had 3 sections,
Uh-huh.
and she was in another section. And so I met her first year, but the academic part, so the social part was strong, but the academic part was a little bit more challenging.
So when you graduated from law school, you said, okay, I'm going to focus on private equity.
Yeah, so when I graduated law school, I graduated law school in 1991. And anyone who remembers 1991, there was a and it was a very tough time.
Yeah.
In all aspects of it. But from a legal perspective, what was really booming was bankruptcy and restructuring.
All right.
So I ended up, the firm I went to out of law school was a firm, Weil Gotshal,
Oh, yeah.
and it was the preeminent bankruptcy restructuring firm, law firm, and so I went there and I worked there out of law school. And so I was there at Weil Gotshal for 3 years.
Was Marcia Sims
Yeah,
there
and
then?
Marcia hired me.
Did she?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
She was
Small world.
she was the reason I was
Was
at
she,
Weil
was
Gotshal.
she a partner there
Yeah.
at that point?
Yeah. So she's the reason why I ended up at Weil Gotshal. And was a mentor to me all the years while I was at Weil Gotshal, and I was doing well there, but I realized that there was something missing, and so at that point in time I was toying with, do I want to continue to practice law, or do I want to go and do what I thought I was going to do when I went to law school, which is go into banking or something like that. And it was during that process when I was starting to, talk to banks and talk to people who was in banking and start to understand what it is that you did in the investment banking arena, that a couple of people raised this area called private equity as something that I might find interesting as they talked to me.
And at that time, private equity was kind of a new, sort of emerging emerging
This
business.
is 1994.
Right? Yeah.
And so there are a couple of small little firms that are doing this kind of work, but it's really an emerging business. And and what was also interesting is that Weil Gotshal didn't have a legal practice in that area. And so I identified there was 2 or 3 law firms really who kind of had a focus on that kind of law. And so I ended up going to one of those firms, and with the thought that I was going to learn everything I needed to learn about private equity from a legal perspective, and then allow me to transition into it on the business side.
Well, that was it's pretty insightful or intuitive, and probably took the ability to be a risk taker, to leave a firm like Weil Gotshal with a mentor like Marcia Sims there at the time, and decide that you wanted a new challenge.
Right.
Is that, I mean, I would imagine that young professionals often come to that crossroad, but don't sort of take the risk.
Yeah.
What advice would you have for people who kind of reach that point in their career?
Yeah, and it's a good question, Keith, and it's something, it's something that whenever I'm talking to young people, I bring this up, the same advice, and it's interesting because as you described my transition or leaving one firm to go to another as a risk, I never perceived it as a risk, right? But it was, because the firm that I ended up going to was, I'm at Weil Gotshal, a large New York City, Wall Street law firm, one of the top firms in a practice that's they considered the preeminent practice, working with the leading partners in that practice, and them telling me how much bright my future was at this firm doing this kind of work. To go to a firm that at that time had 30 lawyers, because it was a law firm that had kind of a boutique practice.
Private equity practice.
And
do you mind saying which?
Yeah. So the firm at that time, it was called O'Sullivan, Grave and Carabell, which eventually, because of the growth of private equity, grew from, I think I was the 30th lawyer, 31, and it grew to 250.
Wow.
And then that's when we merged into O'Melveny and Myers.
Ah, is that how? Okay.
And when that happened, I was already a partner at O'Sullivan and merged into O'Melveny. But the point is that I never thought about it as a risk. And because it was part of what I had identified as what I wanted to do, right? Which was realizing that this aspect of business or an industry where the core mission was to buy and sell or invest in businesses was something that really, really intrigued me. And as long as I can remember, I always thought about that. Even as a kid, I tell people I would walk into a bodega and I would say, if they did this, this, and this place would be worth so much more money. And you could, so it just was it was just a thing that I constantly thought about.
Yeah.
And so I realized that, and so when I made the decision to go to O'Sullivan, I was getting into the private equity business, which was a business, or getting closer to it, that I always had an affinity for. And so I didn't perceive it as a risk. So as it comes back to your question about the advice that I constantly give young people is identify that thing that you are passionate about. What is it that you, and particularly lawyers, because when I'm asked this question, is I'm like, well, how do you figure out what part of law that you're interested in? I said, well, what part of the newspaper do you read that's unrelated to law? What books do you read? What things do you want to go to? What are you passionate about? Think about that without law, and then identify that, and then I can assure you that there's a legal career somehow associated with that. And when you put it in that, I think when you put it in that context, those moves don't seem like risk.
Right.
They seem like walking in your purpose.
Right.
Right? I don't want to necessarily associate some of this stuff with, spiritual and, and more important things. But the point is that when you identify what it is that you're interested in, you identify what motivates you, when you identify what brings you joy, what excites you, you got to bring those two things together, and that's how you connect the legal career to it.
One thing that strikes me as curious is, this is kind of speculation, but do you think that if you had grown up anywhere other than New York, you would have been as sort of confident about your career choices and your college? You would have been able to kind of lay back on the one hand, but move forward confidently on the other. And maybe the contrast would be between growing up in New York and what you can imagine with regard to your parents growing up in Alabama or South Carolina. They certainly didn't have those kind of opportunities, even though I think as you explained your dad was a really a bright guy with a lot of determination. There's something about that if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Did you have what role did your environment, did New York in particular, play in sort of bolstering your confidence?
I don't know if I would say it boasted maybe it's confidence. I never felt confident, and I still to this day, I think in a lot of respects what drives me sometimes is just not wanting to fail, as opposed to being confident and like, I know I got this. I do think though that, from the way my parents, being raised by my parents and their approach to work, I think I did have confidence about that. I mean, I know I can work hard.
Right.
I didn't have that same level of confidence about study hard, but if I'm going to work, that's easy, and I was confident about that, and I think that played as much a role in my success as an associate as anything else, because knowing that I used to always, I would hear in the reviews and as an associate people talking about stamina, and just the fortitude and just the ability to just get things done and nothing seems to shake you.
And they credited you.
Yeah,
with
that was those were the types of things that they would always talk about. And that was just because, it's just work. I'm just gonna do it, and no one's gonna work harder than me.
Oh, interesting.
And so I think that came from growing up, my parents just being in the environment that I was in.
Right.
As a kid growing up, I think that is the thing that comes back to me more often than.
So you don't have to grow up in New York. You if you got stamina and the
grit.
the ability to sort of keep at it and not be discouraged. You can be from Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, and become a partner at a law firm like yours.
Yeah, I guess that's it, right?
Yeah, right. The other interesting thing is once you master your craft, you're kind of in an environment that is, in some sense, still bicultural. At a law firm, it's probably a bit more like Hunter than it was like leaving Hunter and going home. And you said that as a kid, you kind of you lived you related more to Harlem than you did to Hunter. And but now that you still are living in something of a bicultural world. Has that gap closed? Or, I mean, are you do you find that that you're if this were Hunter, would you describe the way you kind of associate within the law firm one of more sort of proximity to the culture of the work environment? Right. How do you?
I hadn't thought about that. There are some similarities to how I interact in my profession and within my law firm to how I interact with my colleagues at Hunter. There are definitely some similarities there. I think I've gotten more comfortable, obviously, over the years, and so that more familiar and more comfortable, and also, I guess, being in somewhat of a leadership position in some respects has made that easier. But even now, and when I was at my other firms, I think a large part of the biggest distinction is, for me, as I can think about it right now, is maturity and an appreciation for how I would have done Hunter differently if I knew better.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so I think now that I know better, it's different, but there is still a certain level of comfort that I have. That's why I still live in Harlem.
Right.
And there is a comfort associated with that that's analogous to what it was when I was growing up. And so I see that.
You talked about your dad and your mother it's really really interesting that your dad was kind of your teacher away from school, and your mother was very involved in the community. And you also are involved with Riverside Hawks.
Right.
I get emails from you all the time.
Good.
And
You sent in a couple of checks yet?
yeah, oh, well. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so it's interesting. So so much of my adult life is playing out things that I saw as a kid, and I guess it might be the same for a lot of people. And I'm just kind of living into those dreams in some respects. So, so with Riverside, using that as an example, so Riverside Hawks is a program that when I was a kid growing up in Harlem, only the best basketball players played for Riverside. Mm-hmm. And it was, it was just, you can go into any community in the entire city and get respect from anybody if you had a Riverside jersey on.
Oh, really?
Or a Riverside jacket at that time.
Wow.
And so I was always kind of good enough to play for Riverside, but I wouldn't have played much if I did. So I never played for them. But it was always, I was always drawn to it. And so when your kids grow up,
Yeah.
right, and you grow up in New York, you're like, okay, you're going to play basketball and you're going to play for Riverside. So that's how I first got introduced to it. My son played basketball there. Now, what has become a big part of my philanthropic activity, because, so when I was a kid, the only person who was more revered than someone who played on Riverside was the guy who ran Riverside. And so he would be, he'd go to park, as soon as he walk in the park, or as soon as he go to the gym, it's like, oh, there goes, at that time it was Mr. Lorch, and he's like, there goes Mr. Lorch, and kids all try to, but he was the person who was really kind of around facilitating and making it happen.
Right.
And so as a person now who, thinks about how do I give back, I always think, well, I'm kind of playing that role that he did, in terms of not the same, because I don't coach anymore or involved in that same way, but helping to raise money for the program, and that gives so many kids an opportunity to continue the legacy of that and that dream. And so that's my connection to it. And that's why it's much more than just a philanthropic. It's an emotional connection in a way, because it's connected to my childhood.
Sure.
And its presence and space in New York City, and what it means in Harlem and things like that. But the other thing that you alluded to that reminds me of, so my wife and I, because I've continued to practice law, and in a partner law for my wife's, obviously, as I talked about, as a lawyer. But she practiced law for 5 years and just woke up and just said, this is not me. And so she became involved in child welfare, worked for the city for a long time. And then about 12 years ago, she went to go work at a not-for-profit in Harlem called the Harlem Children's Zone with Jeffrey Canada. And so she ran, she was COO, running all the programs for 5 years. And then the last 6 years, she's been the CEO of that organization, and which is kind of, when you think about community-oriented in Harlem, that's Harlem Children's Zone. And so as we walk around Harlem and doing things, it's not, kids don't recognize me, but all the kids in Harlem know her.
Is that right?
Yeah, so we'll walk and they say, hey, Miss Ann, how are you?
Right,
and there's kids all over the place. And it's kind of that analogy to my parents, in some respect, because my mom was much more involved in the things that happened in the building and in that little neighborhood.
Right.
And
Did your wife grow up in New York?
no, my wife, yeah, she grew up in New York and she grew up in Queens,
Uh-huh.
Springfield Garden, Queens.
Uh-huh.
And she's, her parents are both Trinidadian,
Uh-huh.
but she was born here in the U.S.
So your children are not African American by that
By that
standard
definition,
of-
no, they're not,
Right.
because two of their grandparents were born in Trinidad.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Or Trinidadian,
Uh-huh.
who my mother-in-law, their grandmother, who has lived with us ever since they're born. So,
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
yeah, so she's the one that's responsible for them going to Penn, not me.
You know, sports is such an important thing in the African American community, and the level playing field of sports kind of gets rid of the politics and favoritism, and it's it's all meritocratic on the field or on the court,
Right.
and it's probably something that you have experienced as an athlete, and it's kind of nice to share that with kids, and sort of it's an interesting observation about the achievement of African Americans when the playing field is level.
Yeah.
Sport. There's just so much achievement in that area.
Yeah. Well, what's troubling to me though is what I've noticed, and this is going back to my experiences now at Riverside, and I don't know if it's this way in other parts of the country, but in New York, what's happening, particularly in basketball, is that the impact of means and wealth is really having an impact on the ability for kids to just succeed. So that kid with that raw talent and ability is being compromised because of the training and the access to the best trainers and the best coaches and things like that comes with means, has really had an impact on, from a perspective of just access.
Interesting.
It has really changed
Wow.
it a lot. And I see it in basketball, and I know it's the same in other sports, in some of the sports I'm familiar with. It's just that has had
Not having the resources.
just not having the resources, and it's sad.
That is.
But that is a reality of sports that I see now in youth sports. That kid with that just raw ability, raw desire, is being for that kid to succeed is being challenged by kids having multiple coaches and things like that comes with having means. So we try to compromise. I mean, to alleviate that at Riverside by having the opportunity for kids to just come to the gym, and we have coaches there. You just work out and you just keep getting better and getting better. But it's a problem. But on the flip side, though, what's nice about sports and what you talked about is, but once you're on a team,
Yeah.
regardless of where you come from or who your mama is,
Yeah.
you all got to compete.
Right. Right.
And there's a bond that comes out of that that's really exciting and nice to see. And just to refer to Riverside, one of the things that I really like about it is the connection that these kids are having. And it's a really unique place in the sense that it is in Harlem / Manhattan. So you do have teams where you have rich kids, poor kids, black kids, Latino kids, white kids. They're all on the same teams, and they're all bonding around that experience in a way that they'll never be able to replicate.
Right. Well, Phil, thank you so much for your comments and observations and contribution to the Amistad archives.
No, I appreciate it. This was really a nice thing to do.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding how you scared me, what I got myself into.
Right. All right.
Thanks,
Okay.
good. All right.